The gravel crunched beneath tyres she didn't recognise. Mildred pulled back the curtain to see who had just parked outside the house. She grabbed a notepad and wrote down the licence plate. At the time, it felt like nothing more than caution. In reality, it was the one clue that would later point directly to her killer. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload on Mondays and Thursdays, so make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. It's December 14th, 1988 in Jefferson County, Missouri, a quiet, affluent part of town where people knew their neighbours and nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. Inside one of those well-kept homes lived 75-year-old Mildred Hodges and her only son, 49-year-old Richard. Mildred and Richard weren't just mother and son, they were business partners. They ran a successful real estate business together, and when they weren't working together, they were socialising, often with each other. Richard had never moved out, the two were inseparable. Now, on the surface, it might have looked unusual, a nearly 50-year-old man still living with his mother, but the truth was, theirs was an unusually close, deeply loyal relationship. Mildred was the matriarch, the driving force behind their business and also their small family. And Richard, he was absolutely devoted to this life. But there was another side to Richard's life. He was reportedly gay. Now, this is 1988 in a conservative city, so that wasn't something you openly admitted, and I did wonder if this was the reason he still lived with his mother and was perfectly content in doing that. If he couldn't be his fully true self, maybe this was the next best option. And Mildred kept her world small but meaningful. She adored her niece Carrie, and the two spoke often. In fact, on that December afternoon, Mildred was on the phone with her niece when the doorbell rang. She said she'd have to call her back. She needed to go and answer it. And when she opened it, there wasn't a stranger standing the other side. It was Helen, a business associate. The two women chatted briefly, made plans for lunch the next day, and then went their separate ways. But the next day, when Helen showed up for lunch, Mildred never arrived, and that was strange. Really strange, because Helen was waiting not just for Mildred's company, just going out for lunch with her, but also for that week's real estate listings. These were deadlines Mildred never ever missed, and for her to not show, that set off alarms immediately. Helen tried calling, but she got no answer, just the machine. Hours later, she drove round to Mildred's house, and right away she noticed something off. The driveway was empty. Mildred's car was gone. She rang the bell anyway, but of course, no one came. Worried, Helen phoned Carrie. Maybe Mildred had gone on a last-minute trip. Maybe she was with family. If anyone was going to know, it would be her niece. But Carrie immediately shot that down. Mildred hadn't planned anything at all. If she had, Carrie would have been the first to know. And so now both women were uneasy. This wasn't Mildred. This wasn't how she operated. By that evening, they involved the police. Officers went to the Hodges home, walked the perimeter, and from the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest that Mildred and Richard hadn't just stepped out. And so, although Mildred's niece and Helen, her business associate, were worried, there wasn't a whole lot they could do. It wasn't until the following Monday, December 19th, 1988, that things really shifted. It had been 5 days since Mildred had last been seen. 2 Union Pacific Railroad workers were walking the tracks that ran along the Missouri River near a place called Marion. It was cold, grey, the kind of December day where nothing unusual should have been happening. But then, one of them noticed something up ahead just off the tracks. At first, it looked like a piece of rubbish, a black plastic rubbish bag. But as they got closer, it became obvious that this bag wasn't empty. It had weight, shape. One of the men bent down, pulled at the plastic, and immediately he recoiled backwards because inside the bag, it wasn't rubbish. It was a human body. Police were called straight away, and when investigators arrived, they confirmed it. This body belonged to a man. He was bound at the wrists with duct tape, still dressed neatly, almost like he'd just walked out of a meeting. Whoever this was, it was clear that he had not died here. He had been moved. At the scene, detectives noticed small but telling details. Faint blood trails leading up the banks and towards another section of the tracks. And then, something strange. A dental retainer lying nearby. When they picked it up, they saw it had a name etched inside. A single word. Hodges. The body was quickly identified as Richard Hodges. A post-mortem would later confirm that he had been suffocated. And of course, police get this identification and they realise that someone else had been reported as missing, someone who also had the last name Hodges. And with Richard's body found, they knew there was no time to waste, so investigators secured a warrant to search the Hodges home. When police arrived, the house looked ordinary from the outside, just as it had been the days before. The doors were locked, no one answered their knocks. But when they checked from the garage, they noticed two things. First, Mildred's car wasn't there, it wasn't inside. And second, there was a faint trail of blood that led from the door and went across the concrete floor. That was enough. They forced entry. Inside, the house was eerily still. No obvious sign of violence, but the deeper they moved in, the worse it got. Past the front double doors in one of the living rooms, they found a female body on the floor, and there was a plastic rubbish bag right by her face. It was the decomposing body of 75-year-old Mildred. Her autopsy later showed that she had either suffocated, like her son, or she'd gone into cardiac arrest in the middle of the attack. Either way, she had died terrified and violently in her own home. With Mildred and Richard's bodies now formally identified, the Jefferson City Police Department brought in Helen. Now, she was the business associate who had first raised the alarm, and the police wanted her to give a statement. And with that, the case really shifted gears, because now it wasn't about where the Hodges were, obviously we knew that, it was more so about who had wanted them dead. Detectives started with the basics: motive, means, opportunity. But right away, a tiny, almost throwaway detail caught their attention. When Richard's body was discovered by the railroad tracks, he was wearing blue jeans. At first glance, that might not seem important, but when investigators spoke to Richard's friends, they all said the same thing. Richard never wore jeans in public. Not once, it just wasn't him. If he wore them at all, it would be in the privacy of his own home. For his friends, this detail stood out so strongly that it became a cornerstone of the early investigation. Whoever had killed Richard had likely done it when he was at home. So alongside all of this, the investigation is still progressing and police are combing through the Hodges' small circle of family and friends. They weren't known to have enemies, but obviously someone had wanted them gone. Forensic teams moved through the house searching for any kind of clue, and in Richard's diary, they found a note. And this really was investigators' first lead. On Wednesday, December 14th, the very last day anyone saw Richard alive, he had had lunch with a close friend. That friend was Dr. David Keplin. He was also the Hodges family dentist. Detectives quickly brought David in for questioning. Now, on paper, he seemed like a really unlikely suspect. He was married, father, a respected professional, but almost immediately, investigators felt something was off. His answers felt guarded, too careful. And then a tip came in from a witness. Richard and David weren't just friends. They might have been having an affair. And if that was true, it meant David had a secret to protect, one that could easily give him motive if something between them had soured. But David denied it flat out. He insisted he was happily married, loyal to his wife, devoted to his kids. Whoever was spreading rumours about him and Richard, he said, was lying. Detectives didn't buy it. They pressed him hard. Now, eventually they asked him to take a polygraph, and surprisingly, David did agree. He sat for the test and he passed. And so there really was no evidence to hold him, and police had no choice but to let him walk. But before he left, they asked him one last question. On that final lunch, had Richard said anything unusual, anything that seemed out of character? David thought for a moment and then said, perhaps, he didn't think it was odd at the time, but during their lunch, Richard had mentioned his mailbox. Apparently, someone kept knocking it over again and again. It's one of those classic American mailboxes. It sits outside the house. The postperson will come, deliver the mail, and then prop the little arm up so you can tell that there's something in your mailbox. But someone had kept vandalising it, and it was happening so often that Richard had finally hired someone to fix it and make it a bit more sturdy. That someone was a local handyman named Ronald Hernandez, better known around town as Little Ron. Detectives brought Ron in for questioning, and sure enough, he confirmed the story. He fixed Richard's mailbox a number of times, and in his opinion, he figured it was just bored teenagers messing around, not anything sinister. But then, Ron mentioned something that made the investigators sit up. Richard, he explained, was extremely particular. When it came to repairing the mailbox, he didn't want just any stone base. He wanted a specific type of rock. And Ron had actually taken him out to a nearby quarry to find the perfect piece. Police immediately clocked that detail because Richard's body had been found near Marion, right by those railroad tracks not far from the very same quarry. Was this a coincidence, or had this handyman just unintentionally given away that he knew exactly where Richard's body had been dumped? To find out, detectives checked Ron's story. They went out to the quarry and they confirmed what he'd said. Richard had, in fact, been there before, searching for the perfect rock for his mailbox. And when they canvassed the neighbourhood, they realised something else. Richard hadn't been singled out. Other residences' mailboxes had been vandalised too. It was a local nuisance, not a targeted attack. Finally, they checked Ron's alibi, and it was airtight. Little Ron was not their killer. Not long after investigators discovered Mildred's body inside the house, a call came in that would really change the course of the investigation. The Hodges car, the one missing from the garage, it had finally turned up. But it wasn't in Missouri. It was hundreds of miles away in Kentucky. Even worse, when officers arrived at the scene, they found the vehicle had been abandoned in a motel parking lot and deliberately set on fire. Whoever killed Richard and Mildred clearly knew what they were doing. Any evidence that could have been inside that car, things like fingerprints, fibres, DNA, that was now gone. It had been reduced to a pile of twisted, blackened metal. But in a strange way, the fire also gave detectives something else. They now knew exactly where the killer or killers had been. So, investigators descended on that Kentucky town. They knocked on doors, they interviewed motel staff, petrol station clerks, anyone who might have noticed someone driving the Hodges car before it eventually went up in flames. But no matter how hard they pushed, the trail just went cold. Nobody saw a thing. Frustrated, the detectives decided to return to square one. They went back to the Hodges house. They needed to comb through it one last time. Now, at this point, it's been weeks since the murders, and they were almost certain that they had got everything that they needed to get out of that house, but they just wanted to make sure for their peace of mind. And to be honest, it's very lucky that they went again. And to be honest, it looks like this came about because the family who had inherited the house wanted to sell it. They just didn't want any reminder of where the murders had happened. And so when police searched it, they found, buried in the clutter of an ordinary desk, something seemingly insignificant. It wasn't surprising that they'd missed it before. It was a notepad and it didn't have any writing on it, but when detectives held the pages up to the light, they noticed a faint kind of indentation, like grooves that had been pressed into the top sheet. It was clear it was marks that had been left behind from a previous note that had then been torn away. So, going full detective cliche, they grabbed a pencil and they gently shaded over the paper. And slowly, a number of letters appeared. It wasn't a phone number, it wasn't an address. It was very clearly a number plate. They checked in with who that number plate was registered to, and it led them to a local man called Thomas Irvin, known as Tommy. Detectives went to his house and they just confronted him directly. They asked had he ever met Mildred or Richard, had he ever been inside their home. Now Irvin shook his head, absolutely not. He said he didn't even know who they were. But detectives pressed harder. They told him his car had been spotted right outside of the Hodges house around the time of the murders, which, if it was true, was a devastating and telling fact for him. But Thomas didn't break. He explained that he couldn't have been near the Hodges home because he'd been travelling for work a lot, mostly down south. And then detectives' ears pricked up because down south included Kentucky. To back up his story, Thomas handed over a pile of receipts, petrol stations, motels, meals, anything to prove where he'd been. And investigators started sifting through them, and while some receipts did confirm his story about working out of town, one stood out. A hotel receipt from a place just across the river from where the Hodges car had been set on fire. Not only was Thomas in Kentucky at the time, he was right there, practically within walking distance of that car park. And he hadn't been travelling alone. These receipts showed that Thomas had been there with a friend, Bert Leroy Hunter. Bert wasn't from Missouri. He lived in Largo, Florida, over 1,000 miles away from Jefferson City, which immediately begged the question, what was he doing there? When police dug into Bert's past, the answer became chillingly clear. Bert had a criminal record, a serious one. He had already been convicted of murder, and at the time of the double murder of the Hodges, he was actually out on parole. And as for Thomas, his past was just as telling. Years earlier, he had also been convicted of murder. He'd been sentenced to life in prison, but unbelievably, he had been paroled after just serving 12 years. 2 convicted murderers, together, in Kentucky, exactly where the Hodges car had been dumped. At this point, detectives knew that they were circling the right people, and while Thomas was still walking free, Bert actually wasn't. By the time the investigation caught up to him, Bert had already been sent back to prison for violating his parole, so detectives decided to pay him a visit. Inside the prison walls, they sat across from Bert and began to ask questions, and what they got back cracked this case wide open. Detectives had initially sat across from Bert. They figured he might deny, he might minimise, maybe even lawyer up. I mean, we see all of those things happen all the time in the cases that we've covered on Red Rum. It's highly unlikely that the person in front of them just starts kind of admitting to what they've done. But to the investigator's surprise, and to be honest, to my surprise too, Bert really didn't hold back. In fact, once he started talking, he just kind of kept going. Yes, he admitted he knew Thomas Irvin. More than that, the two of them had been thick as thieves in the weeks before the Hodges double murder. He took detectives all the way back to late November 1988. That's when Bert had travelled up from Florida to visit Thomas in Missouri. Both men, he explained, were broke. They were desperate, and desperate men, as Bert freely admitted, came up with desperate ideas. At first, Bert said he floated something simple, a bank robbery. Quick in, quick out. But Thomas wasn't interested in simple. He wanted something bigger, something darker. Thomas had a scheme. Kidnap a wealthy person, force them to withdraw their money at the bank, and then make sure they couldn't talk. And just like that, the plan shifted from robbery to murder. They spent those first days driving through Jefferson City, casing homes, looking for the perfect target, but nothing really stuck. And so eventually the plan kind of fizzled out. Bert went back to Florida, but they would still talk about it on the phone. It was very much still there, kind of bubbling away in the background. In early December, Thomas travelled south to Florida to see Bert, and it was there that Thomas started buying supplies, rubber gloves, plastic rubbish bags, little by little building an arsenal for what was coming. By December 12th, they were both back in Missouri, circling Thomas's neighbourhood, looking for the right house, and that is when Thomas saw it. The Hodges residence, a big, beautiful home, a nice car in the driveway, a successful real estate business. In his mind, the little old lady living behind that door was the perfect target. What neither Thomas nor Bert realised was that inside that house, Mildred Hodges had been paying close attention. She heard the unfamiliar car outside, and before she even got to the door, she peered out the window and, because she was careful, because she was smart, she grabbed a notepad and jotted down the number plate. That was the very indentation that detectives would later recover, and of course, that was the clue that blew this case wide open. But at the time, she obviously had no idea what was about to happen. This was just a little scribbling, a little what if. On December 15th, 1988, at around noon, the two men pulled into the Hodges driveway in Thomas's 1981 Mazda. Their plan was simple. Basically, Bert was going to pose as a delivery man, get Mildred to open the door and force his way inside. Thomas would follow, and together they would subdue her. And that is exactly what happened. Mildred opened the door, Bert posing as a delivery man, but then he lunged, grabbed her arm and dragged her back inside. Thomas slipped in behind, shutting the door, and that's when Bert pulled out a pistol. And of course, at this point, Mildred's panicking, she's shouting, she's screaming for her son. And what Bert and Thomas didn't know was that Richard was already home. He was working in the office at the front of the house, running their real estate business, so the moment he heard his mother's cries, he rushed into the hallway. He demanded that they let her go, but Bert just used this impetus to kind of shove Mildred aside. She stumbled, she hit the wall, and she bloodied up her nose quite bad. Richard, desperate to calm the situation, explained that his mother had a heart condition. He begged them to stop. He guided her into a bedroom, sat her on the bed and tried to steady her. But, at Bert's order, Richard himself was forced to bind his mother's hands and feet with duct tape. Still, both Richard and Mildred pleaded for mercy. They told the intruders that they didn't have any cash. All their money was tied up in a trust fund. They swore that if Bert and Thomas would just leave, then they wouldn't call the police. They could forget about this. But then Richard explained that at 1 p.m, a reporter was due at the house. She was coming to pick up a real estate advertisement. The reporter, of course, was Helen, Mildred's friend, and the one who hours later would sense something was wrong when Mildred never showed up. So from the materials that we have, we know that Mildred and Helen were supposed to meet for lunch out, but it seems as though Richard was saying maybe he was making it up, maybe he was doing it as a kind of plan, or maybe he simply didn't know. But either way, he was letting the intruders know that someone was going to be coming to the house shortly. To Thomas and Bert, the thought of a stranger walking in mid-crime was a disaster, to say the least. So they shifted gears. They dragged Richard into the living room, taped his hands and feet, and when Bert heard a sound in the bedroom, he went back and he found Mildred. She was on her feet, struggling. He bound her tighter, this time leaving her on the hallway floor. When he returned, Thomas gave him a nod, and then the violence escalated. Thomas pressed duct tape over Richard's mouth and nose. Richard gasped, saying he couldn't breathe, and Thomas replied coldly, quote, "That's the general idea." Richard fought, breaking free in a burst of panic, but he was overpowered. They forced him to the ground, taped his hands very tightly behind his back, and then Bert told Thomas, quote, "Go take care of Mildred." As Bert suffocated Richard with tape and a plastic bag, Thomas did the same to Mildred in the hallway. Both mother and son died there, side by side. When it was over, Bert and Thomas rifled through the house. They found jewellery, furs, a bottle of scotch, and a pitiful $16 in cash. They dragged Richard's body into the garage, stuffed it into the backseat of the Hodges Lincoln Continental, and eventually drove the car to dump Richard's body near those railroad tracks outside Marion, Missouri. Then they returned later that night to move Mildred, but her body had already begun to decompose. There was odour, fluids, and so they abandoned their original plan to incinerate the bodies, and they just left Mildred inside the home. Over the next few days, they stayed in Jefferson City, even using the Hodges car as a getaway vehicle for scouting banks to rob. Eventually, they drove it all the way to Paducah, Kentucky. When news broke that the bodies had been discovered, they obviously set the car on fire in that motel car park, hoping to erase their tracks. But the evidence had already started to catch up with them. Jewellery from Mildred's collection turned up in Florida, gifted to friends as if it was nothing more than a late Christmas present. And of course, there was that indentation, the notepad Mildred had so wisely written on, the very thing that tied Thomas Everin's car to their doorstep. And all of this, every gruesome, horrifying detail, came straight from Bert's own mouth, sitting across from detectives in that prison interview room. Thanks to the devastating testimony of Bert, it meant that Thomas's fate was pretty much sealed. Bert's words weren't just damning, they were really vivid. He told them everything from that initial planning, the gloves, the bin bags, right down to Richard begging for his life. When the evidence was laid bare, every gruesome detail corroborated by forensic photographs of bodies bound with duct tape, of decomposing remains inside those rubbish bags, there was simply no hiding from it. The jury, after deliberation, returned a verdict. Thomas Everin was guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree robbery, and the death penalty was recommended. Bert Hunter pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to death in February 1990 for the murders, with an added life sentence for robbery. Appeals, denials, motions, none of it altered the outcome. Jurisdictions upheld the verdicts, the evidence stood, and then came the execution dates. On June 28, 2000, Bert Hunter, aged 53, was executed by lethal injection at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri. His final moments were a mix of resignation and pain. He was just remembered as saying, quote, "There is no justice. It's time for this nightmare to be over." And that was just hours before he was put to death. Just 9 months later, on March 28, 2001, Thomas Ervin met the same fate, executed at the same facility. In the end, 2 men, once paroled murderers, met the ultimate price. Death row was their final destination. When those executions finally came, the coverage in the press was blunt, almost clinical. Local Missouri papers ran stark headlines, things like "Hunter executed for 1988 murders," "Ervin put to death in Potosi." Each article recaps the horror with the same chilling detail. Reporters described the victims, Mildred and Richard, as ordinary, decent people. A mother and her son who just happened to open their door to the wrong pair of men. But the coverage didn't stop at the crime. Journalists could not ignore the elephant in the room. Both Thomas and Bert had killed before. They weren't first-time offenders who snapped in desperation. They were paroled murderers, men who had already taken lives, been locked away and then released back into the world only to kill again. That detail sparked outrage and debate in Missouri and beyond, and I am covering a fair few cases of people who have been convicted of murder only to be paroled and then go on to murder again. So it did get me thinking, what is parole supposed to mean in cases like this? Rehabilitation? A second chance? Or is it just a kind of gamble that very clearly comes at too high a cost when it fails? Because in this case it did. It failed catastrophically. Mildred and Richard paid the ultimate price for a system that really took a chance on two men who had already proven what they were capable of. I am an absolute believer in rehabilitation in prisons, but these men had very clearly not been rehabilitated in the slightest. For some people, that fact, that murder on parole, that justified the death penalty. If there was ever a textbook case for capital punishment, this was it. These weren't impulsive killers or men driven by sudden fight. This was premeditation layered on top of a criminal history of murder. But for others, it raised troubling questions. If parole boards and rehabilitation programs had failed to prevent two already convicted killers from striking again, then what did that say about the system as a whole? And more importantly, did executions fix the problem or simply say, well, we'll just kill, we'll get rid of the problem, never mind the many, many more murderers that will come after them? We speak about the death penalty a lot on Red Rum, and to be honest, I have complex thoughts on it. Ultimately, I can't agree with it because of the rate of innocent victims who are murdered by the state on, shoddy evidence or cases that are later disproved. But I do think it's complex. I know there are some cases where the perpetrator is so clearly guilty. Maybe they've admitted to it. There's CCTV evidence. There's undeniable forensics. And maybe those cases, they've killed children or elderly people or just more vulnerable victims. And then, sure, maybe even they agree that they should die for their crimes. A lot of them do, actually. We've seen that many times before, haven't we? But I suppose what comes up here is that you can't have one rule for one person and another rule for another. And as soon as you change the goalposts there, then people are going to try and exploit that. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. But again, guys, this is just me speaking, and I don't have a guest on today or anyone to ask these questions to. So let me ask you, what do you think? Do you agree with the death penalty? Do you think it's an effective means of deterring criminal activity like murder? Do you think it's outdated and unfair, potentially very problematic, or do you just not know either way? I'm going to put a poll in Spotify comments, so please do vote on that. And pop a comment there too if you want to talk more about it. Oh, and of course, if you're listening anywhere else, pop a comment in YouTube comments or on your podcast player, or you can always email me your thoughts. Maybe I'll read some of them out in another episode. Maybe get a discussion going if I have another guest on. But other than that, I will see you guys in a few days for your next episode of Red Rum. Bye.